We are recording. Okay, so I want to share this with you before we get on to talking about Frank Lloyd Wright, who will be the star of the show tonight. For December 7th, I have arranged for this woman, Erin Shakur, to speak to all of you online. That's a Tuesday evening. That's going to be open to everybody in the department, really anybody at Harper. So it's Erin Shakur, and she is a Chicago designer, but she does projects in different parts of the country. We were emailing about a time. I guess when we were emailing about a date, she let me know that she's going to be leaving on December 8th for Boston, so she can be available on the 7th. So nice of her to take time. So here, scrolling down, if you want to, I'm not going to go through all of her work, but if you look at, let's just take number 1 here. This is just examples of her interior design projects. So I think her work is quite good. I discovered her on Instagram, and looks like she does some really nice work. So I'm happy to have her make some time for all of you. And if you look at her website, think of some questions you might have. Even any questions you might have for anyone who is a successful interior designer. What would you want to know from that person? And again, this is a Tuesday evening. It's not during our class. This is going to be it's kind of like a separate event. It's very helpful for you to have the opportunity to speak, to communicate with a designer, to see examples of the person's project and have the designer tell you about the projects. But there are always things that like you can't, it's really hard for you to learn things like what it's really like to hire a contractor when you're doing projects in school, because you're not hiring a contractor. And the experience of it is different than even just saying, like, I looked up this contractor, this is the one I want to use. That's something that's always, I know that with a lot of people who do interior design, once they get contractors and vendors that they work well with, that are reliable and do good work, they do everything they can to keep them. And that's just something I've heard from a lot of former students and designers, that it's really extremely helpful if you know what to expect from the people that are doing demolition, putting down flooring, running the electrical, plumbing, and all that kind of stuff. So that might be a question that someone might want to ask. So this is a lot of really beautiful stuff, and I'm interested to hear. I've never met her in person. We've only communicated online. I just sent her a sort of like kind of out of the blue message on Instagram. I just asked her, would you be willing to talk to the students? So she is. Okay. That is, now I want to do my PowerPoints. Frankie. Okay, and maybe even before we get to Mr. Wright here, as he preferred to be called, um, a little bit about some of the stuff we talked about last week, the Art Nouveau, like Art Nouveau furniture, or just the whole like what Art Nouveau is. Um, so I was reviewing the Furniture: A Concise History book, and for some of the information about Frank Lloyd Wright, and the author writes about no, well, he's writing about everything, but I want to read this to you. Tiffany, so talking about Tiffany lamps, and then the difference between different like styles of Art Nouveau. Tiffany lamps are among the few fully developed Art Nouveau objects to which the word logic could plausibly be applied. So irrational is a term that is often applied to the appearance of Art Nouveau design, like architecture, interiors, and objects, because there's a really a playful and fanciful quality to it. But Tiffany's lamps are objects that have a specific purpose, and so logic can be applied to Tiffany's lamps. Macintosh and Hoffman, then that being Hans Hoffman, who is a Austrian, so the leader of the Vienna, I guess, workshops. Their Wiener Werkstätte is the German term for the Vienna workshops, which sort of coincide with, they're sort of more in the spirit of the like Macintosh, or what's called sometimes called the Glasgow school, or like Glasgow art version of Art Nouveau. Macintosh and Hoffman are Art Nouveau designers only in the most chastened sense. Yet even their work, we are often aware of the element of irrationality. For example, to the extreme tallness of the backs of some of Macintosh's most typical chairs. Art Nouveau, at its most typical and flamboyant, flourished not in Scotland or Austria, but in France and Belgium, as we saw. Victor Horta, the Belgian, who all the crazy viney-looking millwork, for example. The French designers of the school of Nancy, best known are Émile Gallet and Louis Margerel, looked in a very different direction from Macintosh. For them, this is what I liked so much about what I read. For them, furniture must have a kind of poetry, like the paintings of Redon or, you won't know those guys. It must lead the spectator into a dream world of half-glimpsed, half-apprehended images. So that to me helps some of the Art Nouveau stuff make a little bit more sense, that it was intentional, that is irrational or even dreamlike, that it's really meant to transport you to something else. So, sort of like transport you from, even like if you're indoors, what's outside to what's inside. That you have this transformation of space. And that, I think, is very important for interior design, because you do want this, there is definitely a difference when you're outside your home to when you're inside your home. And interior design is about really making it as, comfortable, beautiful, unique, or special as you can. Okay, that I wanted you to hear, because I think it is apt, and it's I think it's something that should be emphasized. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright, American, the Abrams Guide refers to Frank Lloyd Wright as perhaps or probably the most creative American architect of the 20th century. He began his career in the last decade of the 19th century and enjoyed a long and colorful career that lasted almost 7 decades and spanned a number of design aesthetics from arts and crafts. So he was sort of a proponent of an American version of arts and crafts, which the prairie prairie school, which he was sort of like the leader of this like Midwestern architects. There were other prairie school architects, but Frank Lloyd Wright was the undisputed leader just because he was the best known. From arts and crafts to international style and biomorphic modernism. His late work you could call biomorphic modernism. And if you want to review this, this is page 244 of the Abrams Guide. There are a couple pages about Frank Lloyd Wright, followed by some excellent photographs of some of his furniture. Okay. The so-called, although in the last decade of the 19th century, Wright designed a few houses in the then fashionable Queen Anne style, he quickly broke with the establishment. Most of his early work was a radical departure from cluttered Victorian design, compatible with arts and crafts ideals, yet reflecting his own distinctive aesthetic. So he sort of developed what might be called an American version of arts and crafts, but it's unique to the U.S. One of the things that is a feature of the Prairie School is horizontal. We in the United States, there was more space than in Europe in the 19th century, and so when you built a house, you could get it was easier to get a larger plot of land and to spread it out. And so single story, more horizontal orientation to a house was not only possible, but it was emphasized by someone like Frank Lloyd Wright. One of his objections to the Victorian houses were these rooms there were a lot of very tall rooms that were all divided that were cut off from each other in some way. And so Frank Lloyd Wright was one of the first people to use what is called open plan, something that we should all now be very familiar with in homes, because it's less and less. I think it's sort of more of an option that you don't have doors closing off rooms all the time. And the modern idea that you want to be able to move freely through your home without having to constantly go through closed doors or having barriers between one room and another. Now, this is not always the best thing. Sometimes you want to be able to close off part of a space for privacy, noise distraction. This was something that I read about this in the early days of the pandemic. There were a lot of people rethinking their open plan homes because they couldn't get away from anybody. You could hear everybody doing everything wherever they were doing it, and it's like, oh my God, give me a door. So sometimes we encounter, we sort of find the limits of some of the things that we do. And in offices, like in commercial space, I know I've experienced this, maybe some of you also have experienced this, but open plan offices where it's just like a big room with a bunch of cubicles or desks is really distracting and noisy. There's this someone somewhere creates this fiction that it's all about collaboration and people are bumping into each other and like sharing ideas all the time. I don't need people constantly interrupting me. And if like I had this experience where someone trying to promote like the quality of an open office to me when we only had like maybe like 3 or 4 floors where you would go like, where people had offices. And it was like, I could just go upstairs or I could call or send an email. I don't need to like, have like people constantly, it's just like, oh, I just thought of something. Like, let me work. Open offices are, you'll see this. Frank Lloyd Wright designed some open plan offices, and there are good things and bad things about them. So, open plan, it's a new idea. I don't always care for it, but there are times when I think having an open space is quite nice. But you can attach open plan with Frank Lloyd Wright. Okay. Okay, so I'll return to this book. The so-called prairie houses in suburbs outside of Chicago exemplified Wright's organic approach to architecture. He believed that a building should evolve naturally from its surroundings and the land on which it was built. And these houses did precisely that. Their rectilinear form hugged the ground, emphasizing horizontals rather than verticals, with projecting roof lines and broad strips of windows that blurred the boundaries between interior and exterior space. Also a feature of modern architecture, blurring the boundary between interior and exterior. In later designs, he moved even further, sometimes even reshaping the landscape itself in order to fit his concept of integrating site with structure. To Wright, a single-minded and autocratic man, the relationship between elements of a design was more important than any specific form. Every part must relate to the organic whole. And this is an idea that can be referred to as total design. The modernists, we'll talk about them later, in the early 20th century, embraced this idea that a house or a building should be integrated as an entire thing. He was adamant in controlling every facet of his projects, including the smallest accessories and often even his clients' clothings. He was a control freak. To Wright, so let's see where I got that. Although it cannot necessarily be said that there is a single Frank Lloyd Wright style in interiors, most of the homes he designed share several characteristics. The typical Wright interior has a relatively low beamed ceiling and rooms that flow seamlessly from one to another. Horizontal bands of windows sheltered by overhanging roofs are punctuated by stained glass inserts. A palette of understated colors drawn from nature and the surrounding landscape is given variation and contrast of tone and texture. Unfinished wood grain, stone, rough plaster, and brickwork. He was a proponent of using large industrial machines to put a nice even finish on wood. And he also was someone that recognized the beauty of wood as a material by itself. You don't need to carve it, paint it. You can just get a beautiful piece of wood and put a clear finish on it, and it's done. That's all you need to do it. This was a new idea of just appreciating the beauty of materials. It was very hard for especially the neoclassical styles, very hard for them to tolerate a wood that was not carved or painted or stained. You got to do something to it. They just couldn't. They couldn't stop fussing over it. Stained glass or art glass in exquisitely precise geometric designs for windows or lighting fixtures might be the only strong color in these spaces. So neutrals, muted colors, beige, which can be kind of bland, but his idea was that he liked color to be understated. Wright's furniture was designed specifically for the interiors in which it is placed, though it is not always graceful and often not particularly comfortable. It is distinguished by sharp angular forms, often emphasizing horizontal edges, with cantilevered elements that echo the architecture. Made of stained or fumed oak. Put on my better glasses. It has surfaces that are relatively rough and unadorned. Intersecting horizontal and vertical planes, like those in his architecture, are largely free of ornament, and what ornament he added was either geometric or highly stylized. He did do some ornamental work. There's a have any of you been to the Rookery in Chicago? No? Okay. I'll bring up. You can visit the Rookery. It's a building in Chicago, like down in the Loop, and it was designed by Burnham and Root, the guys who did the Columbian Exposition, but they Wright in the early 20th century was hired to renovate the lobby. It had sort of like a lot of dark cast iron structure in there, and Wright came along and oddly used a lot of marble and gold. But it was really kind of like a little like Sullivan-esque. Okay. Many Wright interiors include built-in seating or storage that provide the most efficient use of space and underscore the absence of clutter or extraneous ornament. Absence of clutter, that was very important to him. These carefully composed spaces reflect the influence on Wright of Oriental art, or Asian art, we should say, particularly the Japanese woodblock prints he collected. The Usonian houses of his later career, and Usonian is a term he invented, and that is literally meant to refer to its usefulness. The Usonian houses of his later career are the translation of his concepts into affordable middle-class housing. So he and a lot of other architects in the post-World War II, and even before World War II, were developing ideas for prefabricated houses that could be built at a much lower cost and therefore become more affordable. So the idea of affordable housing is something that architects have been trying out for a long time. And part of what they wanted in terms of making it affordable was that if you had prefabricated pieces, like prefabricated panels of wood or stone, prefabricated designs and layouts, you could have everything delivered to the site and built on site. And this is something that did happen. There's after World War II. We'll talk about this in the later weeks. Levittown is one community that was built very quickly, relatively small houses, everything like prefabricated, delivered, and assembled on site. And partly that was because after World War II, the United States had this population boom, or so it was experiencing a population growth, and they needed to build housing in the 50s pretty fast. And thanks to the industrial output of World War II, they had the industrial capacity to do so, because the United States was the only nation in World War II of the big nations involved in the fighting that did not have the warfare occur on its territory, with a few exceptions such as Pearl Harbor or some balloon bombs that landed on the West Coast. So, all right. So Frank Lloyd Wright, not such a terrible guy. Thanks to that desire to make affordable housing late in his career. Okay. So finally, although he refused to acknowledge the influence of either history or other architects, everything Wright did naturally just sprang from his perfect, beautiful brain, apparently, which is nonsense. Everyone's influenced by something. He worked for Louis Sullivan and pretty much just at the beginning of his career just copied Louis Sullivan's ideas. Although he refused to acknowledge the influence of either history or other architects, Wright's design evolved in the course of his career. Many elements of his mature work, particularly the horizontal planes, flowing spaces, and continuity between interior and exterior, are compatible with the aesthetic of the international style, which we will get to in a later week. That's like the European modernists. Okay, so here, this is a later building. Anybody ever been to this museum, the Guggenheim in New York City? One of his last buildings, but this is where you see where he ends up. Looks futuristic, spaceship-like, or something. Like a evil, like a supervillain's headquarters.
I thought it was designed to be like a snail.
Possibly. I mean, I don't know if Frank Lloyd Wright would ever admit that a snail gave him an idea, but the thing is, like, when you're creative people, when you develop like a creative sensibility, everything you see potentially influences what you do, and it never really gets turned off. So he could very easily have seen, because a spiral is a really beautiful configuration, and it does work. I would not be surprised if a snail shell, like the spiral on a snail shell, just made him think, oh yeah, that's a beautiful and elegant, and it's mathematical.
Well, also the interior, it kind of spirals down
It
inside.
does.
Yeah.
It does. It's a really, if you have you been there,
Yes.
and did you start at the top or the bottom?
Well, the bottom and went up. Yeah.
Yeah, usually it's. I did the same thing the first time I was there, and like by the time you're like going up this ramp, you realize like I should have started at the top, like take the elevator to the top and then go down.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting. I mean, it's really an interesting building. Okay, so before you have so before we get to this, so here's his house. A house he designed for himself in Oak Park, Illinois, 1889. There are tours of some of his architecture in in Oak Park.
I've been to that one.
What?
There's actually a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright buildings in my town. We live on the North Shore in
Oh yeah,
Glencoe.
yeah, yeah. He was very active in doing residential architecture. The He started out working. He started out doing like working for Louis Sullivan and started taking like projects, like residential projects on the side, and got fired for moonlighting, which in those days, if you had a job, you weren't supposed to have another one. So moonlighting is he do this, and I believe he was poaching clients from Louis Sullivan and they just like, get out of here. So he also got into a fist fight at work because he was like always correct. So
There's a great book about his affair he
yeah,
had and how that house in Wisconsin burnt down. I mean, I think it's a fictional account, but
yeah, no, it's he is possibly a murderer. It's not clear how his wife died, but he was having an affair with a client's wife. Was that?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And he had a lot of children.
Yep. He was a man, doing what men do. Men don't have to be like that, but a lot of men, I mean, men are. Um, so, but yeah, sometimes maybe is people will like it's compelling to get into like the personality when someone is like is so like I don't know. Um, he's successful. He did a lot for creating a very specifically American style of architecture, which was a big deal in the 19th century when everything, you know, a lot of in like literature, in art, architecture, most Americans were still tied to European standards, like um, and or just like more traditional things because it was a younger country, and in even just in literature like Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote the Scarlet Letter, he was one of the first really uniquely American authors, and that's something that the American creative people were trying to establish. So Frank Lloyd Wright was very successful in doing that, and in architecture that was not easy. So and yes, all his the details of his personal life are very interesting.
He must have been a good salesman though, because when I went on a tour of his residence near the University of Chicago, and they were saying how it's not the most functional, and the residents like found it really cold and would let a lot of air out, and
Yeah. Well, I think I think he was persuasive.
hmm
Um, he also was like very good at just convincing people like what I'm telling you is correct.
hmm
Anybody else comes along and tells you it's wrong, they're wrong. You gotta listen to me. You gotta do it my way. And people was like yes, sir, Mr. Wright, or whatever you say. Um, and he was known for being difficult. Um, and yeah, I mean, well, he expected people to do it his way, and he would fire clients. I mean, if clients said like, "Oh, I don't know about this," he'd say, "Fine." Like grab the plans and walk out. Say, "Get somebody else to build your house." And then some of them would come crawling back. And they're like, "Oh, please, Mr. Wright, take us back." So here is a mural, very looking pretty Japanese, and it's sort of like and this is almost like you could say is a little bit like like chinoiserie, where this is sort of like a it's an it's something that's meant to look Japanese, but it's American. So here is an example of a traditional Japanese house in Kyoto. This tatami mats, like, um, well, the Japanese had long ago figured out a modular system of architecture where you have a lot of panels that are the same dimensions, and so it's very easy to, um, it's sort of it's a very organized way to create um, I guess, to use that for a proportioning system. So this being very simple, this is from the 17th century, and this is like kind of like one of the something kind of like what modernists aspired to, and Frank Lloyd Wright as well. Now, this to me, like early stuff, like the early Prairie School stuff, it looks like it owes a lot to arts and crafts, and I don't think that. I mean, I would, even if Frank Lloyd Wright himself insisted that arts and crafts had no influence on him whatsoever, I would just tell him to his face, "You're a liar." I see Macintosh. I see William Morris. It's the same fireplace surround. It's that same arch in brick. Don't tell me. So this is the Japanese pavilion at the Columbian Exposition. This was probably the most popular attraction at the Columbian Exposition in 1893. Everybody, this was like it was exotic and unique, and this, the first time a lot of people were seeing traditional Japanese architecture. They went to a lot of trouble to bring not just not just the architecture, but I know like there was like in part of the exposition there was an Egyptian pavilion, so like an Egyptian village that was rebuilt, and they brought Egyptians from Egypt to live in it during the World's Fair or during the Columbian Exposition. It was like they want, this was like pulling out all the stops. So here is a table lamp by Wright. And like geometry, the rectangular geometry is very important. It's kind of fussy with a lot of parts to it. These cubes all along the bottom, it seems a bit overdone at times, but still very modern. Tree of Life window, art glass. So this is like, the kind of like art glass that was done for his houses that he designed. I really like this stuff. It's gorgeous. Sketch for it. This is for the sumac window. And there's a sumac image of the sumac window. This is in Springfield, Illinois. That's a beautiful, beautiful window. Okay, so here a diagram of development of modern floor plans. So the image on the bottom is like a Wright open plan. So you can see where there are some solid walls, floor to ceiling, and the fireplace. This is also where you'd have structure, and then the rest of it is really more like partition wall. Here's a house in Kankakee. These all over the Midwest, and especially around Chicago. So you can see here in this, there are rooms that are closed off. The kitchen is closed off. Bathrooms, of course. There's a sitting room in the back. But like if in this, like the dining room, living room, reception, entry, all of that is open. One room flows into another. Not completely, it's not just like a big open, like a warehouse. There definitely is like a smaller like a doorway or just like a threshold between rooms, but it's all very. I mean, this is like this idea of free flowing space, or the sort of the feeling that there's like it's you have freedom of movement within the space. And you can see from the scale of the furniture, some of these rooms are quite large. And the windows, the like very generous number of windows along the outer walls lets in a lot of light. But again, that fireplace, that is like it's like it came right out of like that's William Morris. I see William Morris's influence on him. Sorry, Frank. All right, so here's the Roby House. You mentioned going to Roby House, this is the one down by University of Chicago. So there is a like upper story, but here are some photographs, vintage photographs. So this is when it was still pretty new. This dining, so here like the dining table, Macintosh did similar things with these very tall back chairs around a dining table to enclose the space around the table. So this is sort of like creating this like little environment within the dining room. You see that there are lamps, like the table leg is really a pedestal with a lamp on it. And I understand that in some cases, maybe this one, the owner of the house secretly cut those off because it was just an obstacle. Frank Lloyd Wright's mind, you sit there and this sort of like provides illumination around the table, which is great. But apparently, like trying to serve the dinner was just too difficult. It was like, where am I supposed to like reach in? But I love the idea that this is sort of like the total design, where he designed lighting as a part of the table. Living room. So this is like the pattern in the architecture and pattern in the lighting. All of that was important. And you'd need with lighting was still relatively weak in these days, so um, you'd need a lot of those globes up there to generate sort of like an appropriate level of lighting. More art glass windows at Roby House. Oh, so this is early. So this is early 20th century, 1909. Taliesin. So, Stephanie, have you been to Taliesin?
No, I haven't been there because we did all the Chicago places because my son was really interested, and they don't let younger kids go there except for once a month.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's the one that burnt down and they rebuilt it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so you can see this is there's a lot of like very rough stone, um, and this is an interesting to me. This is interesting. So this is where he Frank Lloyd Wright lived for a period of time. And he built this sort of like a home and a place. He also had there's a school. Taliesin was his like place where he trained architects, and there's also Taliesin West in Arizona. Um, and I believe they recently just stopped accepting new students. They're like no longer teach. I didn't know they were still teaching people, but this is where people like students would go and live at Taliesin and learn architecture from Mr. Wright or his assistants. Something that I think is really one of the more interesting things about this is like the way he brings surfaces together. There are these smooth wood or glass surfaces running right up against rough stone or plaster, like in this case, the ceiling up against the stone. And this, is a really good example of like the difference between outside and inside becomes less and less obvious in modern, in some modern architecture, and in this in particular. Public architecture. Here is Unity Temple in Oak Park, which I really enjoy the fact that it looks more like it's a power plant or something. It looks like it's like a industrial building. But I would these an architect such as Frank Lloyd Wright would be well aware of things like monumental architecture of temples from the ancient, like Egypt, Greece, Rome, Persia, and I would this looks kind of like it's a modern Egyptian temple, like little baby temple. This is not the same scale as the Egyptians built, but here's an interior of the Unity Temple, and quite beautiful. But this is, you can see, it's all his same rectangles, 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 rectangles. The early part of his career, it was like rectilinear, you could say. There are these globe shades for the lights, but otherwise I see rectangles. All of this, like the chairs on the side, up in the front on the side of the table. Yeah, those are Frank Lloyd Wright chairs. I love the muted color scheme, and it's just like the unit, really like this sort of like unifying rectangular form and shape. The Larkin Building in Buffalo, New York. Now here, so you have temple, commercial, like a commercial, office building, really. So where's the light coming from? It's coming from the skylight. This is an idea with like something that was important with modern buildings. As they get taller, now we have the elevators were invented in the 19th century and became common in tall buildings, and it allowed tall buildings to be built taller and taller. And here in 1903, just a couple decades away from some of the super tall buildings in New York City, Chicago was the place where tall buildings were first made. And excuse me, if you have a tall building that has a relatively large footprint with weak electrical lighting, the middle of your building will get very dark. Unless you've designed it to have a light well, which is what this is. So it's really kind of like a rectangular donut. There are offices around the edge, and the middle is open with a skylight, so it lets light in during the daytime. At nighttime, different story. But a lot of buildings that were built in the late 19th, early 20th century have light wells. I used to work in one in Chicago. So here is some of the here is his open plan. Just lots of desks, like workstations. And he designed the desks. He designed the furniture for them. So this is an upper story. See, the windows are high, so you can't look out the windows and get distracted, but the ceilings are tall enough that the windows can be large and let a lot of light in. You can see they don't need the lights on. So here are the furniture that Frank Lloyd Wright designed. With the fold-out surface that comes out from underneath the desk, which you would fold it out when you're working. And it's pretty simple construction. Here's a chair that was used there. You can see this, like just the back of the chair is just a plank of wood. It is a board, probably with with a simple finish on it. The cafeteria. Looks cool. I mean, in the beginning of the 20th century, this would have been a very modern looking interior. Oh, and I think that's all for the early Frank Lloyd Wright stuff. That's good. We're going to take a 10-minute break right now, and I'm going to show you some later Frank Lloyd Wright. We're going to get farther into the 20th century with Frank Lloyd Wright because I think it's worth spending the time to just like do this now, not break it up. Oh, yes, and to answer the question in the chat, I'm going to, this is a question about the Aaron Shakor I guess, presentation or event we're going to do. The time will be it'll be from 7 until 8 p.m. or maybe a little bit later. And I will create an online invitation, and I will ask Carl to send it out to the entire interior design department. And I'm also going to work on creating a poster to have sent out to everyone too. Okay. Stop